The new head coach that the Nets decide to bring along is Kevin Ollie, after the Knicks recently decided to fire Jack Vaughn as their last head coach, who they for some reason recently signed for an extension, only to fire him afterwards. But we'll talk about that a little bit later. So they obviously had to replace for the coach that they ended up firing. So they ended up getting interim coach Kevin Ollie for the job. And just like Vaughn, his coaching experience isn't really that strong. Ollie was the head coach for the Yukon Huskies around the time the Huskies left the Big East and joined the AAC in 2012. And now the Huskies, they were, during the time span of during his tenure as a coach, they were relatively well. In his first year, they ended 20-10. In the second year, they were 32-8. Then in 2014-2015, they were 20-15. 2015-2016, they were 25-11. 2016-2017, they were 16-17. 2017 and 2018, they were 14-18, where he was then eventually fired from the organization in 2018. He did lead the Huskies to their fourth national title in 2014, however, which was ultimately their best season, going 32-8. So then he took a break from coaching and coached for Overtime Elite from 2021 to 2023. So again, not the experience that I would personally want from a head coach going into mid-season at all. Like, what's worse is that we've already seen what could happen to a team if they were to replace their head coach mid-season. I mean, obviously, like, we did see we also saw Jack Vaughn completely turn the Brooklyn Nets around from losing with Steve Nash to going on their best win streak in franchise history. But the argument could be made that it was just the fact that he was coaching Kyrie Irving and Kevin Durant. Those two are some of the best isolation players that the league has ever seen. And therefore, there wasn't really much that needed to be done other than to make sure that the players were standing in the right spots and Kyrie and Kevin Durant had enough space to operate and the lineups were catered to their play style, if you would. And when you have players like that, and it just makes the job so much easier, because I'm just adjusting the lights real quick, don't mind me, because it makes your job easier because there's not really much that you need to do as a coach. The players end up doing the job for you. Like, they're so good that they can provide on the offensive side of the ball, so that way you don't have to worry about drawing up plays and trying to confuse the defense, which is something that Golden State tends to do. Like, Golden State is one of the few teams that doesn't necessarily rely on isolation. They do, don't get me wrong, they do. But a lot of their plays are derived from off-ball screens, on-ball screens, and a combination of passes to get the defense moving. And with that in mind, it takes great chemistry and great coaching in order to pull off that kind of offense and that kind of ball movement to perfection. Like, so that's sort of the difference between, like, having a good coach and having, like, a coach that sort of does nothing and it allows their players to sort of operate more into their own system rather than into the system of an offense that he has set. That's sort of the difference between Vaughn's coaching experience at first starting with Brooklyn compared to what it's ended with Brooklyn, to where, okay, now he sort of doesn't really have that many competent players, and some of these players don't even want to play all that many games. Ben Simmons. So having that, with that in mind, was it fair to fire Vaughn mid-season? I personally don't think so. I personally think that the Nets should have kept Vaughn for the remainder of the season, and if they were going to move on from him, they should have done that after the season, because Right now, the team is out of the play-in conversation. They could make a run if they end up doing well. Who knows? And they could make a spot in the playoffs if they win the play-in games. But then again, it's like replacing your coach mid-season is not going to help the team. The team is already facing a bunch of head coaching changes because a lot of these players recently were acquired via trade. Therefore, they were playing under a completely different head coach. And some of the old players, like Mikal Bridges, Cam Johnson, they all came from Phoenix in the Kevin Durant trade. And now they're expected to go from Kevin Durant, from being coached by Vaughn from being coached by the head coach on Phoenix, which at the time I believe was Monty, to then being coached by Vaughn for a few months, to now being coached by a completely new coach that doesn't have much experience, Kevin Ollie. So with that in mind, it's a lot of coaching changes. It's 3 coaches in the span of like about a year. And with that in mind, I'm not really sure that that's a good step in the right direction. The Bucks have already changed their head coach mid-season, and we've seen the results of that. So far, they've been 3-7, and they've not been relatively good in the regular season. Therefore, with that in mind, we're doing the Nets are doing the exact same thing, and it doesn't make sense. And they're stuck between a rock and a hard place right now because I feel like the Nets should tank, honestly. Like, they should just completely, like, they should start over, get ready for the next season. This season is lost. Like, there's no point. And I just don't understand why they decide to just bring a completely new head coach into the mix of already the amount of problems that the Nets have. Because Vaughn was expected to do a lot for this team. Like, he already had a lineup set up with Kevin Durant and Kyrie. Then they request a trade. So now his lineups have to be different. And now he needs to implement Cam Thomas into the lineup. And Cam Thomas is a terrible defender. He's one of the worst defenders I've seen. There are times where he literally straight up just leaves his assignment to go double team for no reason. You can't do that in an era of spacing. So he's a bad defender, and Vaughn has to learn how to manage that with the lineups to be able to cater to his play style because Cam Thomas doesn't really like passing the ball. He is a scorer. He's really good at it. Don't get me wrong. He is really good at it. But he doesn't necessarily pass the ball. And that's sort of what the team lacks. They lack a true playmaker. They have Dennis Schroeder. But Dennis Schroeder, like, seriously, he's a bench player. He's not going to lead us anywhere. And we need a very good starting point guard to lead the Brooklyn Nets somewhere. And it's just this new coaching change. It doesn't make any sense to me. It really doesn't, because it's a whole new setup that they now have to change. And what if this coach has a completely different play style than Vaughn, and now these players have to learn something completely new on the fly? And it's just not something that I think, it's not a sustainable position. I don't agree with this whatsoever. And they should have just stayed. They should have stayed with Vaughn for the final year, and they could have just fired him after the season. Like, again, if this season was a lost cause like it already was, I feel like there was no need to just make it even more lost with a completely different head coach. It's really bad. And with that, I think with this coaching change, the Nets, they might be done. I think they might be completely done for the rest of the season. And there's really, like, there's just nothing that the Nets could do now. And looking at this article, like, they've fallen out of top 10, and they've made the change, like, over the All-Star break. Like, I understand why this firing completely, like, I understand why this happened. They recently lost to the Boston Celtics by 50-plus points. They only scored 86, while the Boston Celtics ended up scoring, like, 138 or something like that. And obviously, that's a really terrible loss, so it makes sense how he got fired directly after that. But again, the season was lost anyway, so it was just a waste of time. Again, I keep saying that the season is lost, but again, it's just like it was lost. There was really nothing else that they could have. There was nothing else that they really could have done. And Kevin Ollie, I mean, why would you rather have a coach that has college experience as opposed to a coach that has NBA experience already in Vaughn? I mean, experience triumphs over practically everything in this light is falling. Whoops. Experience triumphs over practically everything in this league, and you sort of need that experience in order to remain an effective basketball player, an effective coach. And obviously, like, sometimes experience is like it could be the downfall of some teams, like the San Antonio Spurs with Greg Popovich, all the experience he has in winning championships. And so far, this team with the Spurs is looking nowhere near championship contending. But again, like, I mean, he won an NCAA title, cool, but UConn is known for getting a lot of great athletes, and they're known for winning NCAA titles. They literally just won a men's title last year in the NCAA tournament. So it doesn't really surprise me that he ended up winning with the Huskies at one point in his career. It's obviously really difficult. Not going to downplay that, but again, it's the same trend of being aided by a lot of great players and a lot of great prospects. That's the same thing that Vaughn had. That's the same thing that Nash had. Nash just couldn't handle coaching Kyrie. And to be fair, nobody can really handle coaching Kyrie. It's really difficult to coach him. So he had to be let go. He wasn't a relatively good head coach because, again, these players, they were ISO heavy. So there was nothing that really needed to be coached there when you're in ISO heavy positions. And with that being said, there's barely any room for error. It's usually the players that mess up. And while it's not relatively fair to fire the coach when the players do mess up, the coach is responsible for running these plays. And if what you usually run isn't working, then the coach needs to be there to make the adjustments so that way their offense can work and their offense can continue to score. That's sort of like the basis of having a coach, and that's the main problem with ISO-heavy lineups. Because once the ISO doesn't work and once teams figure out how to defend it, or once they're having a bad game, there's nothing that they can do. And we saw this trend in 2022, I believe, when Kyrie Irving and Kevin Durant played arguably the worst game 2 I've ever seen in my life. They went like 1 for 18 from the field in the third quarter and the fourth quarter. They missed every single shot, but for some reason, Steve Nash never called timeouts while they were missing shots and while the Boston Celtics were going on a run. The Brooklyn Nets were up by about like 20 points at one point, and the lead slowly ended up going away because Kyrie and Kevin Durant were taking way more shots than the rest of the team because of how ISO heavy they are, and they were missing. Because they were missing, the Boston Celtics were able to continue to score because of the lack of defense, and the Brooklyn Nets ended up losing that game. And so having those ISO-heavy lineups and having a coach that doesn't make those adjustments ends up being the downfall of some of these teams. But just a little bit that I wanted to talk about with this new coach. Again, not really much that could be said about him because there's not much experience. And unlike with Doc Rivers, where there's a lot of things to say about Doc. And speaking of Doc, we're out of time with this first segment, so I'm going to go into the third segment, where I talk about J.J. Redick having a few things to say about Doc Rivers and his coaching experience. So I will be right back after this short break.